boxcar made its final rounds above the city. Tension rose as the American B-29 rocketed through a once hopeful, now dying sky. Air raid sirens commenced early that morning in the presence of the American plane. The city had been spiraling into chaos, loud sounds echoing across the town that morning. Now, at the moment, the sirens had gone silent. Many people had continued their day-to-day lives, yet shaken by the presence of the jet. They remained cautious. For some people, they looked to the sky for hope, a vast expanse full of opportunity. Now the people of Nagasaki looked towards the sky in fear and suspense. A once hopeful, now dying sky. 3 days ago, 200 miles away from Nagasaki, the B-29 Enola Gay introduced the world to hell on Earth, opening a gate to torment and sorrow. Smoke continued to pour from the scorched terrain. Ashes flooded the city of Hiroshima. Thousands of people vanished out of thin air. The devil did not come from beneath the earth. No, it came from the sky. Welcome back to the next edition of The Other Side, featuring your hosts Joe Billy and Harry Oganathan. Tonight we are going to delve into the horrors and the chaos that took place in Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. It should be noted that this edition features fictional characters who are based off of actual real-life accounts of people who have lived through this point in time.
Banjiro Takahashi left his home with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He didn't want to consider it, but on the train to work, he kept having the thought that today could be the last time he could ever see his family, his wife Aiya, and his 4-year-old son Kenji, and his home. As he stopped and made his way into the Mitsubishi Center, Banjiro saw hordes of people walking around him. Yet since the bombing of Hiroshima, fewer people walked around. Thousands had already evacuated Nagasaki just to get to safety. All over the district were news clippings and papers being passed out about the bombing of Hiroshima. City blocks burned to a crisp. Only the buildings with the stronger structural integrity are still standing. It was unrecognizable. 67% of Hiroshima's infrastructure was destroyed. Headlines read, "Japan attacked. Atomic bomb has devastated Hiroshima. Dozens were found dead and thousands still missing." In one paper, a quote from the American president, Harry Truman, which revealed the operation and the existence of the atomic bomb, stated,
"It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws his power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East."
It was part of a speech given 16 hours after the bombed little boy detonated over the city of Hiroshima. The speech showed that a driving force was brutality of the Japanese in the Pacific Theater, as seen with the suicidal bombing of Pearl Harbor, which drove the United States into war. Banjiro looked at all these papers and let out a deep sigh. It was disturbing to see all those images. It was like a scene taken from hell. Yet it was strange. In all of the texts and media outputs, it was stated only one explosive was used to wipe out the entire city. Just one?
His opinion was shared by many in Japan's government. Many were still in denial that Americans had transported and detonated one explosive on Hiroshima, simply based on the level of destruction. Nagasaki was covered in a thick fog, yet as time progressed, the cloud that still lingered above dissipated. These were particles straying from a typhoon that was headed towards Iwo Jima. Since the bombing, sightings of 2 American weather observation planes flying to the Tinian Islands, circling around the island of Kyushu, kicked off a widespread panic. People have suffered several sleepless nights due to these air raid sirens going off. However, today, the people of Nagasaki woke up to a calm morning on the 9th. It wasn't until 7:48 that the sirens went off at another sighting, around when Benjiro entered the Urakami Mitsubishi and Armaments factory. It died down at around 8:15 that morning.
At around 10:30 that morning, a meeting with the company director and survivor of Hiroshima, the director began the interview. Banjiro began to record the transcripts of the conversation with the victim, whose name was Mr. Nakamura.
Mr. Nakamura, Before we begin, we want to thank you for your willingness to come here. The board asked for any experiences from employees who worked in the Mitsubishi factory in Hiroshima during the bombings. We need a full report on Hibakusha, the people affected by the bomb. We ask you to come here to tell us your story, and hopefully you can tell us the full events and the story of your survival.
Benjiro listened carefully to what the man had to say. He talked about what he saw and what happened. How there was one bomb that was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. How he could only see a bright light in front of him, constant ringing in his ears. It was like God just said it all to us, the man stated. Ichi told them of how he was lucky to survive, how he was able to jump in a ditch before it was too late. Destroyed buildings, bits and pieces everywhere, and then he remembered nothing more, only to wake up in the hospital a day later on the 7th. The company director had one more question for Ikku when he was done with the story.
I'm sorry, you said only one bomb was dropped. How is that possible?
Mr. Nakamura assured the man that he was telling the truth. His eyes did not deceive him. The clouds above the city continued to move in and out. The American plane drew near. The primary target, Kokura, had been covered up in mountains of clouds, making it impenetrable to get through without having any aviation difficulties. The pilots grew anxious. A lackluster takeoff saw the plane cut short of 640 gallons of fuel. Now the plane was at 300 gallons of fuel, and it was quickly depleting. The secondary target must then be sought. Yet the area above them and the target was covered in clouds. The exact altitude to drop the bomb without hitting the ground too early would never be achieved at this height. Never. The captain waited, hoping to God that something might happen. Time marched forward, yet still no change. As boxcars circled above the city, its presence alerted some Japanese forces to investigate. For the most part, the boxcar made its entry at Nagasaki discreet and secretive. The crew was now losing faith. Fuel had almost run out, and the bombardiers waited the command anxiously, a call from the captain that may not even happen, at least today. They stood before the Leviathan. With a length of 10 feet and 8 inches and weighing 10,265 pounds, Fat Man is significantly larger than its predecessor. Yet in hindsight, it is, in fact, small compared to the plane, and tiny, an insignificant speck compared to Nagasaki. Yet, it was the only major weapon carried in that plane, and that will be potentially dropped. The only one. The crewmates continued to scour the vast skies while being tracked by the Japanese forces. Time was running out. The fuel was almost drained. The captain of Boxcar, Major Sweeney, had two choices: divert the plane and finish the mission another day, or continue to scout the area looking for any open spaces. The choice he would make would determine the fate of the target. Sweeney began to pull the plane away.
The company director left the room momentarily to use the bathroom. Benjiro was still in shock at what Ikku had just said. He was still confused about the strangeness of the situation. Yet through the strangeness was the hope that it was all fake. Ai and Kenji should be fine. When I go home, they'll be there. When I go home, I'll give Ai and Kenji the biggest hugs and watch the sunset together with them. It'll be fine, right? The captain of Boxcar, Major Charles Sweeney, began to pull the plane away when the clouds below began to move. The clock was now approaching 11:02. The clouds then moved towards each other. They began to move away. As they formed a hole 1.5 miles wide, and below that hole lay the target. Natural forces unintentionally gave them a second chance. At that moment, no one mentioned anything, and the plane continued to pull back, until when Captain Kermit K. Beethan, the ship's bombardier, announced, "I can see the target." It happened in the blink of an eye. There it was, laying on the drop panel of Boxcar, and now released, Batman descended from the heavens, accelerating every second. It glowed like a dancer, cutting through the air with such precision. The light of the sun flew down through the opening in the layer of the clouds, acting as a spotlight, obscuring the silhouette of Fat Man. It was now 11:02. Right now, it was approaching 2,500 feet above the target. 2,500 feet right above the Urakami district. directly above the Roman Catholic cathedral, a symbol of divinity.
A once hopeful sky, now destroyed in light. As the bomb reached the altitude of 1,650 feet, the heavens erupted and shone brighter than any star. The rays of light cascaded down in a burning rage. The atmosphere shot streaks of embers and smoke particles in all directions. It transitioned from a dreamy blue to blood red in an instant. White light exploded, encapsulating every single block of the city. Angelic light, so bright, just looking at it for a second would burn your retinas. The sound it made was like the universe collapsing, being ripped apart, and being crushed to dust. Benjigos tried screaming. He could feel his soul and the sound escaping his throat, yet he could not hear anything besides the blast. His ears felt like they were being punched multiple times with the force of a freight train at full speed. The detonation was otherworldly, like God crushing this world into oblivion. The heavenly armies rained down their arrows of fiery light, burning the earth to a crisp, and black floaters covered his entire vision. All he saw was darkness consuming the light. He closed his eyes and kept opening them non-stop. He opened his eyes and squinted, and almost everything around him was covered in white light. He realized he was on the ground. His silhouette was at the gates to heaven. Yet he was not ready. Not now. Not yet.
The pressure coming from the explosion was so tremendous that the glass from the window fractured instantly, as it fell into a million pieces going everywhere. The projectiles collided with Benjir with such force that they pierced his skin, with cuts everywhere as blood began to flow from him. It felt like the heavens had come to collect his spirit, or hell had come to consume his soul. He couldn't see anything more, only darkness, yet he could still feel the floor tremble and shake. The heat of the explosion began to melt the metal of the building. Particles entered the building, and embers scorched the skin of Benjir, sending a searing pain throughout his body, like his flesh had begun to peel back from his body. He felt his skin swell and burn away. It was like a solar flare went through his internal organs. He was engulfed in a black cloud. Then his mind detached from his soul. He stopped thinking, stopped breathing, yet the pain continued. It still remembered the searing pain, yet it was a frozen image, a frozen feeling. All of this happened in a matter of seconds, yet now, for Benjiro, it seemed like time just froze. This was the last thing he would see and feel. After this point, he wouldn't comprehend any more pain or anything else. A wave of heat would have incinerated the flesh and bones of his body, destroying the nervous system in a single burst of energy. It was like his body was frozen in a dark abyss. There was nothing else to feel or see. He just vanished out of thin air.
Sweeney looks toward the skies. Boxcar was at a height of 33,000 feet in the air. The mushroom cloud rose to above 66,000 feet in the air in the first 30 seconds of the explosion. Shockwaves had rumbled and exploded outward in all directions. Sirens were going off inside, and the whole plane shook with each boom. It was a grand sight. The plume of light reaching upwards, and the whole city was covered in smoke and particles. The sheer power of the bomb was still in full effect. The plane continued to shake like a rag doll as the shockwaves continued to explode outwards. The sound of the explosion was, though muffled, still bouncing all over the ship. All of them were silenced, hushed. All just looked in awe at what they had done. No buildings were visible. only smoke and plumes of fire. Several photographers inside the plane and some on the weather observation planes captured the sheer presence of the mushroom cloud. It was like the sword of the devil itself had pushed through the city of Nagasaki and engulfed the towns in its army of smoke. A quote from one of the lead engineers of the Manhattan Project, J. Robert Oppenheimer, stated,
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
all they could do at that point was just leave. They had done it. The mission completed. It ended with success. They were successful.
Some 40,000 people were caught in the initial blast of Fat Man, including Benjiro. Many others suffered a far worse fate through radiation poisoning, developing serial keloid scars, intense vomiting, and coughing. The bomb had a yield of 21 kilotons and was 40% more powerful than Little Boy, though the destruction was restricted by mountain terrain. Within the next 5 years, 100,000 deaths were attributed to the bombing. Benjiro's family had been the lucky few who survived being far away from Hiroshima. Yet neither Kenji nor Ayu could comprehend that Benjiro and 40,000 people vanished from thin air. Humans can't comprehend disappearing like that. While some people found ways to cope with it, some people couldn't understand. Some simply wouldn't move on. While medical treatment helped very few recover physically, many people could not heal emotionally because they couldn't find peace with the demon that robbed them from their families.
Thank you very much for joining us with this edition of The Other Side. We would like to give a big thank you to the World War II Museum, the Atomic Archive, and the Smithsonian Museum for providing us with the information to help us conduct our research for this project. And we would like to give a big thank you to Ethan Wong for being the company director in the story. The quote for Harry Truman came from the news outlet C-SPAN, and the quote for J. Robert Oppenheimer came from YouTube.